Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak briefly on the regulatory reform bill. Mr Speaker, a bill like this raises the question of what is the role for regulation in both our economy but also our society more broadly. I think it's hard in having this debate not to talk about the leaky houses disaster in New Zealand. The leaky houses disaster was a result of lack of regulation. It was driven by an ideological agenda, an anti-red tape so-called ideological agenda in the early 1990s, caused by the 1991 Building Act brought in by the incoming National Party government. Now, Mr Speaker, I've had a chance to look at some of the documents around the 1991 Building Act at some length to engage in the debate around the role of regulation. What people often forget when they talk about the inefficiencies of regulation are the astronomical costs of lack of regulation. The leaky buildings crisis will cost our country something like $20 billion, somewhere more than $20 billion, in order to repair the buildings that were leaky and damaged as a result of lack of regulation. So in terms of the debate around what kind of regulation we should or should not have and what kind of sits behind this bill, which is an anti-regulation position coming particularly out of the 1980s and 1990s, which the ACT Party obviously goes back to, coming out of that kind of ideological position is that in the past this kind of ideological position has caused massive damage to the New Zealand economy. It's hard, really. I mean, when you say $20 billion, it's really hard to... It's difficult to put that into a debate. It just sounds like another number. But when you think that some of the examples given earlier in this debate, people said, oh, such and such a regulation cost the country a few $1 million. Might have cost the country $10 million if so-and-so hadn't gone ahead with such a regulation. Lack of regulation of the building industry cost our country more than $20,000 million. $20,000 million damage was caused by the ACT Party ideology as it was back then and is kind of trying to get a life of its own again here, and the National Party in the early 1990s. So when the National Party, last time it was in government, introduced the Building Act 1991, Treasury papers that sit behind that act were very clear. They said, we don't need regulation of the building industry, and we specifically don't need regulation around trying to make sure that building standards remain high. They said the market would sort it out, and that the courts, if there were any issues about shoddy building, the courts would sort it out. This is exactly the wrong framework to have when it comes to dealing with the question of regulation. So for this bill to come up again and for the National Party ideology from the 1990s to kind of come back again and relive like some monster from the deep, it seems to me extraordinary that there hasn't been a learning from the 1990s about what happened, given the cost, the phenomenal cost to our country. I mean, this is a cost, something like 5 times the cost of the Canterbury earthquake. So people have talked a lot in this House about the cost of the Canterbury earthquake, maybe $4 to $5 billion. The decision not to regulate the building industry, not to have proper regulation of the building industry by the National Party in the early 1990s has cost our country 4 to 5 times the cost of the Canterbury earthquake. It is phenomenal when you think that the wrong ideological framework, so adopting an anti-regulation ideological framework, which kind of just seems like the world of ideas. I mean, hey, people spruik on about this, that and the other. I mean, it's just an idea. Ideas can be immensely damaging. And in this particular case, the ideas coming out of Treasury at that time, headed up by a man who's since been on to become an ACT Party candidate, coming out of Treasury at that time, the anti-regulation ideas that ACT have promulgated and find their home in parts of the National Party these days, those ideas cost our country more than 4 to 5 times the damage caused by the Canterbury earthquake. The Canterbury earthquake was a massive natural disaster. And yet the ideas coming out of the far right in finding a home in ACT and to some degree National are a calamity of a scale 4 to 5 times greater than the disaster that was the Canterbury earthquake. Probably. I mean, when you think of all the people in our country that have had to live inside leaky houses, with all the fungi that actually grow inside leaky houses, probably people have died as a result of leaky houses, whereas nobody died, fortunately, in the Canterbury earthquake. So those ideas which form part of the debate around this bill about what is the role of regulation in our society, those ideas have been immensely damaging to our country. And so I would say to the government, when you play footsie with the ACT Party using these kind of ideas and kind of when you're looking at a bill like this, do you really want to relive the leaky houses disaster all over again? Because those anti-regulation ideas that sat behind the leaky housing disaster are incredibly expensive and damaging to our country. So that would be my contribution to the debate around the regulatory reform bill. I think that this is a debate that we need to have in a mature way and an acknowledged way, rather than simply ideological slogans like too much red tape, which is about as far as it gets with the ACT Party. Actually, red tape could have saved our country $20 billion in the cost of the leaky houses disaster, but we decided we'd just let anyone build a house. I mean, who needs rules to keep out the water? I mean, why should you have a rule? This is what the National Party said. Why should we have a rule that says houses should keep out the water? That was what they said in the early 1990s. Why should we have such a rule? And so they turned their backs on having a rule that said houses should keep out the water. Well, actually, that's quite a good rule to have. And the leaky houses disaster proved why it's such a good rule. And $20,000 million later, it's time that we acknowledge that regulations play a positive role in our society, because it means that the houses keep out the rain and don't rot from underneath you. So in terms of the framing of this debate and this bill, I would say think about regulations. They can play an extremely positive role and save us many tens of billions of dollars in costs and an immense amount of misery.